All right, so we'll go ahead and kick this off. First off, I just want to thank you, Rich, for joining us. I want to thank everybody here in the chat for joining in for this webinar on, from prompt to policy, staying compliant with AI tools. Rich and I are going to have a fun conversation here. It's going to be super conversational. This is not scripted. We want to have time for Q&A. As questions come up for you, please, gang, drop them into the Q&A. We'll have some of our team going through and triaging those, and we'll find time to ask Rich some of these important questions. And this is also being recorded, by the way. So if you have to hop, we will send you a replay video. So it's Richard Chen, founder of Brightstar Law Group. And part of the reason why we asked Rich to join us today, to me, has a lot to do with two things that I want to talk to you about, everyone here. I want to talk to everyone here real quick about automobiles and the seat belt.
Mhm.
So I did a little bit of sleuthing, did a little bit of research. You think about the Industrial Revolution, you think about the turn of the late 19th century, late 1880s, you've got the invention of the automobile. Fast forward to about 70 years, it's 1956, 1957, and Ford vehicles don't have seat belts.
Mhm.
They are actually optional. At the time, 1956, it's about $27 to upgrade to get the seatbelt package in the car. That's about $315 odd dollars in 2025 dollars. And about 2% of people who buy a Ford at that time, 1956, 2% opt for that optional seatbelt package. So what's my point? Why am I bringing this up? And I want to see if you agree with me here, Rich. To me, it's any adoption, any advancement, be it technological, even on financial instruments, the adoption and the progress usually outpaces the rules, the laws, and the safety and the regulations that go behind them, because
Yeah.
we are in uncharted territory. We're moving into the unknown and pushing the edges, and it isn't until later that we look in the rearview mirror and we go, you know what? This is probably a bad idea. We should fix this. We should get some laws in place. We should get some regulation in place.
Yeah.
And that, to me, is a transition into what we're talking about today, because we have these phenomenal AI tools. You and I were geeking about AI before we started this webinar, and we're adopting it. We're using it. We're excited about the productivity gains and the potential for breakthroughs. But you and I both know it does come with some risks. It does come with some trade-offs. So your article that you wrote on Kitsis came across our radar. So, we'll share a link to this in the chat. So it was on Kitsis's website. It's called Major Compliance Risks when Using AI Tools and Best Practices to Mitigate Them. So before we hop into some of the risks involved with using all these tools so that we can improve our business, so that we can improve our practice, so that we can serve prospects and clients better, is there anything at the top you want to share about your excitement with these tools that we're covering? That way we start upbeat before we go into the risks.
Well, I think they are absolutely fantastic, and I use them in our practice. I think there are, there's a lot of tools, and so part of the challenge that we face is trying to understand and wrap our heads around the fact that there are so many variety of tools, and yet, the rate of change is one of the sort of big problems here, because innovation seems to be speeding up faster and faster, right? And I agree with you, Angel, completely that the regulations really respond to sort of the risks that are seen. Part of the challenge is, ChatGPT came around roughly 2 years ago, and even though there was a sort of some attempt by the SEC to try to get their heads around sort of how to regulate it, the reality is it's still very difficult, and even difficult for compliance professionals, because these tools continue to evolve, right? So part of the reason I wanted to sort of write this article for the Nerd's Eye View was in order to help sort of frame what I see as the biggest sort of issues that we encounter with the technology, and how do we sort of start to think about the how to manage those risks. The reality is that we're still waiting for substantive regulations from sort of the securities regulators in terms of how exactly it's best to to regulate the use of these tools, right? But there are some underpinning things which we'll talk about today, which I think invariably will come up in the course of sort of discussing those regulations.
Got it. Well, thanks for sharing that. And we'll hop right into the risks then. We'll just go. I do encourage everyone here to check out your article. I think it was phenomenal. It's a long form article. It's methodically arranged, and we're just going to be speaking. We're going to use that as the jumping off point for this discussion. And and one of the first risks we'll talk about here has to do with client data and privacy. So what are some of the issues? What are some of the risks with using these tools, and how they relate to exposing or potentially exposing client data and
Yeah,
privacy?
it's a good question, and I think what this is where we can start with specific regulations, right? For SEC registered advisors, we're talking about Regulation SP, and for state registered advisors, there's a corollary at the Federal Trade Commission privacy rules, right? They look relatively similar, right? They require a privacy policy notice that shares how you share client non-public information, which, as a refresher, is name of the client with additional sort of details such as contact information, date of birth, social security number, or different ways of identifying the client. And so, these regulations require you to notify clients how you use them, to put in place, safeguards, administrative, technical, and physical safeguards to protect that data. So, what happens when you use them in an environment where there's an AI tool, is that AI tools are in some ways they're like other types of technology tools, right? They store your data and they likely log what you're doing, but there's an added element to it in that these models are specifically designed to train on that data to improve their outputs, right? And some of them do and some of them don't. But part of the issue is that trying to get our heads around how the tools are storing that data, with where they're storing that data, and most importantly, I think, for in terms of a new challenge, how they're training on that data creates issues for us to sort of really try to think about how we use these tools, right? And I think that this is where it's vital, as we do with other vendors, right, that have client non-public information, to understand how they are storing and processing this information. In the case of the AI tools, how they train. And there are some sort of things that we do in common, with respect to these tools that we could do in other sort of situations if we're not dealing with an AI tool. You can, in many cases, you can do your online diligence to figure out if they've had breaches. Oftentimes they have terms and conditions that outline how they store, process data, and how the tools might train on your data. If you're dealing with more sort of customized providers, they might give you internal control reports that can help you to understand their processes for storing data and making sure that it's safe. But then, of course, there's off-the-shelf providers that are harder to get a response from, depending on depending on the vendor that you're talking about. And so at the end of the day, the same rules apply, in the sense that we need to do diligence on the vendors in order to understand whether or not it is safe to use or to share client non-public information, sort of with the tool that we're using, because invariably there are more tools now that don't train on your data, and there are more tools that that are more sensitive to safeguarding client information because they know that their livelihood very likely depends on it, right? If people can't feel sort of confident that they can put information without it being shared, then they're not going to use the tool, right? That's sort of at a high level what I would think about in terms of how to evaluate the risk from data security standpoint.
Got it. So at a foundational level, I hear you talking about doing your due diligence in picking a vendor in the first place,
Oh.
and on an ongoing basis, knowing how they're using the data, knowing how they're using it to train, knowing what their policies are,
Hmm.
and knowing if there's been any breaches. Now, what about some practical elements for, because just so that we can warn people some of these risks. So let's
Yeah.
think about note takers, and then let's just think about some of the chat interfaces in general,
Yeah.
ChatGPT,
Yeah.
Claude, Perplexity. So let's start with the note takers. So, the note takers are invited into a Zoom meeting, um, and it transcribes you and it transcribes me. What do advisors have to think about in terms of the, client advisor relationship or in prospect meetings when it comes to like an actual note taker? Obviously, they have to notify them that they're being recorded, but is there anything else that they may not be thinking about?
Well, I think it's important to understand how these tools are actually sort of storing and processing that data, because and these are generally tools that are more commercial, off the shelf. One of my strong recommendations is to check the terms and conditions, right? Terms of use of a lot of these tools. They actually do, have quite a bit of information about how they are storing and processing information and whether or not they're using it to train their models. I don't think a lot of note takers do that, but still, I think that the online terms and conditions oftentimes contain quite a bit of helpful information, and so understanding that and sort of logging the fact that you do that right initially, and I would recommend at least once a year on an ongoing basis to make sure nothing has really changed, is really helpful, right? And to just to I would recommend, just as a broader sort of way of thinking about this, putting together a spreadsheet, right, with the tools that you've evaluated, and maybe sort of brief notes. I don't think it has to be like a giant volume or a due diligence memorandum or anything like that, but it should have something that shows I actually looked at this, and I either got comfortable with it or I didn't, right? And so I think that's a very practical way to look at some of these more commercial off the shelf tools.
Got it. The you mentioned you mentioned terms and conditions, and I
Yeah.
couldn't help but think, all right, terms and conditions
Yeah.
are dense, they're information
Right.
rich.
Right.
However, I can select all and add everything in terms and conditions into
I know where that's going.
yeah, into Google Notebook
Yeah.
LM or
Yeah.
ChatGPT Claude, and
Sure.
just start just start pelting it with questions like, hey,
For sure.
let's grade this. How safe is this on a scale of 1 to 10 based off of this rubric?
Yeah.
Are there any specific questions that you would ask? Anything that would be on your mind that you would really want to make sure you account for in terms and conditions, like any red flags?
So this, I mean, I think that's exactly what I would ask, right? I think it's kind of ironic that we would use those tools, but they are very practical and helpful in that respect. It's like, what red flags do you see, right? If I and this is, we'll talk about this a little later. Your prompting makes a huge difference here, right? Give it context. Make sure it understands that you're an investment advisory firm subject to privacy rules, and make sure that it understands that framework so that it can try to flesh out what it could see as the biggest risks, if you're using the tool. And it's also important, right, with more specific granularity, you know to the extent it's not obvious with the tool, like how you plan to use it, right?
So that's a great transition into, so we'll still stay on client data and privacy.
Mm.
We talked about the note takers, we talked about due diligence and terms and conditions. Now, I know some of the note takers do this. In fact, one of my friends is he's attending, let's see, David, I think I saw you on here. He had mentioned to me he was using a note taker app, and he shared with me that the note taker app was able to give him ideas on content that he could write. And
Mhm.
because it gave him ideas on content that he could write based off of a conversation, it
Mhm.
didn't pull in any personally identifiable data or client data to, undermine anyone's privacy. But
Mhm.
let's say someone wants to take a transcript and they want to generate ideas. They want to go from the note-taking part of their stack to the content creation slash marketing stack. And they want to come up
Yeah.
with blog post ideas, things to add to their editorial calendar, and they have 10 different transcripts, and they're thinking to themselves, I've gotten so many questions across these 10 different transcripts. There is gold in here for me to be able to create marketing content. I want to move these transcripts, or at least high points of these transcripts, from the note taker into XYZ tool. What should I be mindful of? Like, I know my approach would be, in the note-taking tools, there's usually a chat interface anyway. So I could ask it and give it a prompt like, hey, take this transcript, and I want you to pull all voice of customer, uh, type of information, pain points, objectives, and values, and give me some ideas for content, and remove all personally identifiable information. And then I would just take that output, and then I'd go, slice it and dice it and do all sorts of new things with it. But
Yeah.
from your perspective, taking a transcript and then
Yeah.
using it in an interoperable way with other tools, it sounds like there's a level of redaction that we should be mindful of, which you did cover in your article a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, and there are specific tools for that. I mean, but at the end of the day, this is one of the important points to bring up, right? Whenever we use AI tools, there has to be a certain amount of healthy skepticism, right, with respect to how we use these tools. And at the end of the day, human intervention is key, right? And what in this particular context, it means that you're going to have to go through and really, because you're dealing with a heightened risk, right? Client privacy breach is a big deal, right? You're going to want to take a deeper sort of human sort of view to looking at making sure that there's no issues when you're porting
Mhm.
from one AI tool to another. Um, unless you're absolutely sort of confident that both tools do exactly what you need, human oversight is important. And we say this when we put together policies and procedures, not only sort of at the front line in terms of when you're porting over the information, let's say for use in another tool, but at the end of the day, compliance should have some visibility into sort of looking at the inputs and outputs, right? That you end up having. And we'll talk about books and records later, right?
Right.
Um, Making sure that, hey, in fact, that the client non-public information was not in there if you know were not supposed to use that tool or use NPI in that particular tool, right? So human oversight is vital when we're talking about sort of risk management.
Right. So we are the driver and the tool user. The tool is
Yes.
not using us. So that's a good segue into outputs and
Right.
into content. So you alluded to this earlier
Yeah.
in talking about inaccurate outputs and hallucinations. I've been on the receiving end of some of this when it comes to getting the output. I start reviewing research, I start reviewing, content and ideas, and I see things that look a little off. And I know the hallucinations are kind of a feature, not quite a bug, because this is a generative tool, and it
Hmm.
is a large, there's a lot of large language models that we're dealing with. So it's predicting what the most likely word or set of words or string of words is to be next. And obviously,
Hmm.
you're going to get some things in there that may not be factually correct. So let's talk about some of the risks with inaccuracies and hallucinations, and what to do about that.
Yeah. So yes, I think the fact that they are predictive, but also bear in mind they train off of other data, and the reality is that there's, we can talk about how much, but there's a lot of false information out there too, right? So it is training on certain information that it may or not necessarily understand is wrong, and so I think we always have to treat the outputs with a healthy amount of skepticism. The challenge, especially when you use conversational tools, is that they sound incredibly persuasive, right? And we have to bear this in mind, that they are oftentimes designed this way to make us have confidence. But it is important to have that healthy skepticism. I do think that a significant amount of that risk can be managed, because I think that a lot of what comes out in terms of bad outputs is due to the fact that you have bad inputs, right? As they say, garbage in, garbage out,
Mhm.
right? And so when we prompt a tool and we need something inaccurate, it requires a significant amount of understanding of how to prompt the tools, as they call it, prompt engineering, right? And the fact that your prompts, if you give it something that is pretty vague, a one sentence prompt, it might not have that full context, and it may really make some assumptions that it shouldn't, right? And so this is where I think that I would tell people there are some very good prompt engineering courses out there for free that you should pay attention to, because they can significantly reduce the amount of um, hallucinations and faulty information that you get. I definitely have noticed that in the course of refining my prompt engineering skills. It's definitely a lot less than it, and the tools got better too. So
Right.
yeah,
If only we could all be as confident as AI. Because you're right,
hmm
it's never unsure of itself. It doesn't come
right,
back to me and say, I don't know, Angel. I mean, I suppose this could be the answer.
right,
So yeah, it definitely suffers from the Dunning-Kruger effect. But
right, right.
hey, that is a human attribute as well.
hmm
So I'm finding a through line in what we're talking about. So, we went over the client data and privacy. We're talking about the inaccurate outputs and hallucinations. And the through line that I'm finding with what you're talking about is you're putting the person at the center. You're putting personal accountability here.
Yes.
You're imploring upon us, we are the driver. We need to
Right.
be really intentional about our prompts, and we need to be mindful of our own cognitive bias. It's interesting, as ChatGPT has a prompt engineering course, they have a bunch
Yeah.
of resources. Uh, the AI tools themselves can help you with prompts.
Yes.
If you're struggling with a prompt, you can say, hey, I want to interface with you a lot better. Here's what I asked you. Can you help me refine what I'm asking you so that it can account for any bias, or so that I can get the output that I want?
Yeah.
But it's interesting that you mention all of this, because I find myself, in addition to studying these tech tools, using these tech tools and taking these courses, I'm also reading a lot on cognitive bias
Mm.
and logic so that I can be a better thinker,
hmm
so that I can be a better prompter, so that I can get
Right.
more out of these tools. I'll even ask, I might, load up a string of context into a tool, and then I'll ask it, hey, what is the straw man here?
Mm.
Am I employing circular reasoning?
hmm
What am I overlooking?
Right.
So it is helpful to start to learn all the different ways that our brains can play tricks on us, so
Yeah.
that we can have better inputs, whether that's just looking up mental models, cognitive biases, reading the work of Daniel Kahneman,
hmm
thinking fast and slow, just to get that
hmm
exposure to all the different ways that our thinking can lead us to ask the wrong questions. And
Sure.
I'll let you speak to that in a moment. I'm just going to share something on the screen here. It's a side-by-side comparison that you had included in your article.
hmm
One is a prompt that is biased. It's asking a very
hmm
binary question
hmm
without
hmm
context.
hmm
It's, what's a good portfolio allocation for
hmm
retirement?
Mm-hmm.
which is super general.
Mm-hmm.
It's not taking into consideration what is this for, who it's for, why it matters. And then there's that second row where
Mm-hmm.
you put a more reasonable prompt that is not binary. You
Right.
asked, explain the factors an RIA should consider when creating a portfolio for a client
Mm-hmm.
who's 5 years from retirement and risk averse.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot to unpack there. So let's talk a little bit about bias and asking better questions and what the risks are
Yeah.
when we do ask very biased, very binary questions.
Sure. Yeah, and that's always the hard part, right? Because it's very hard to identify our own biases, right? And I think that that definitely sort of flows through to how we prompt. Even with those prompts, I mean, I think there are certain things that you had pointed out that I would add to the prompts, right? What am I missing? Am I, am I showing certain biases here with how I'm looking at this? What would you, what would you say as the strongest argument against sort of what you put out there or something like that, right? I think there's a lot of ways that you can use these tools to help you manage that risk. And the more information you give it, the better. The other thing that I think is very, very helpful in order to get consistency is to develop prompt libraries, especially if you're going to use um, prompts consistently, right? Instead of typing it in all the time, you can have prompt libraries, you can have custom instructions in terms of how you use these tools now in a way that will hopefully get you consistency in the results by you plugging in, or at least more consistency, right? By plugging in the prompt with the same parameters that you use, right? So it helps to think about even it's very easy to use them off the cuff. It is very helpful to think about the use of these tools as process, right? And how do you end up sort of deriving the results you get. Think about it from a sort of, so it's not arbitrary, it's from a sort of process standpoint. I think that can help hopefully sort of reduce bias too.
Right. So this is a good transition to we're generating our outputs, we're creating prompts. And by the way, I don't know what tool you use to store prompts. I use Notion
Mm-hmm.
just to store a lot of prompts in Markdown language.
Yeah.
Occasionally, I've created maybe a really long prompt, maybe 250 words or more,
Yeah.
and I'll save that in a text file
Right.
and I'll just name it. It could just
Yeah.
be Feynman technique or
Yeah.
interview technique,
Yeah.
and I'll add that to a project, and then I could just tell Claude or ChatGPT, hey, I'm coming up with some ideas about ABC.
Yeah.
Uh, why don't you execute text file Feynman technique and
Mm-hmm.
ask me the series of questions that I have preloaded in
Right.
that text file. That way it can just run me through that prompt without me having to, copy and paste it every
For
single
sure.
time. Is there anywhere that you store prompts, be it a text expander?
Text files. I use text expander, text files. I'm pretty old school in that. I mean, I store it. I store them in Word documents that we have. It's funny because in some ways I use technology, advanced technology. In some ways, I'm like, this is just the easiest way for me to access it.
Right.
But one of the things that you mentioned, I think, is very new and pretty exciting, right? Now you have these tools that you can make specific projects for, right? Meaning that they can simply provide you outputs based on your custom instructions, what you upload to the project, right? If you want it only to consider certain things, and this is what people have been sort of dreaming about, is that if you ensure that you put in only the data files and information that are right, that will help quite a bit in terms of making sure that your outputs or I mean, a lot more, certainty that your results are going to be what you intended them to be, instead of it going out there and training on stuff that may or may not be accurate, right? So these project um, features that are coming to some of the sort of more sort of commercial AI tools is pretty exciting.
Right. It's funny that you mentioned that because I when ChatGPT first came about, the thing that I was most excited was it was incredibly validating because I'm a consummate note taker and journaler. I had taken a course called Building a Second Brain. For 13, 14 years. I'd been exporting all of my Kindle highlights and notes and keeping them stored somewhere. And
Mm,
now this tool became available that allowed me to query, to
mm,
connect,
mhm.
to reference the whole body of work that I'd been putting together. So it was like a nerd's dream because I had all this stuff that was bespoke for me
Yeah,
that I'd
yeah,
been
yeah.
collecting over so many years.
That's super cool.
So now that we're talking about, you know, contents
Yeah,
and assets and prompts and all this output and all this work, let's talk about, our next point here, which is books and records obligations, because
yeah,
now we're inputting a lot of data into the system. We're generating a lot of output from the system that could lead to decisions, that could lead to communications. And I'm sure there's a whole world of risk that we need to be aware of, that we need to have in our field of vision as well.
yeah.
So let's talk through some of that.
Yeah, so when we're talking books and records, they sort of overlay it with the fact that there are regulations, whether you're SEC registered or you're state registered, right? The SEC has Rule 2042 under the Advisors Act, and states oftentimes have their corollary for that, right? Part of the challenge is that there's a lot of records you're required to retain. And parsing them out based on specific documents and all that stuff can be extremely, extremely difficult. So, but at the same time, retaining and storing everything, is that practical? I think it's one of those things where we have to wrestle with the fact that, there are issues, with books and records retention, right? It's hard, and it complicates things that we don't necessarily easily parse out based on, especially since we generate so much content that these days, right? Or output, right? Work output, hard to go through and sort of think through like, oh, this fits neatly in this category and that's because sometimes it doesn't, right?
Right.
Here's the problem, though, with not retaining records, is that when we start to use AI tools and they have inputs and outputs, which I've said is the best practice to retain them. Um, it, if we do end up having inaccuracies and they're not checked, and we build on that, it will exacerbate the problem. Uh, depending on sort of how you're using the tool, if if you're using certain assumptions that are based on faulty data and those flow through to future outputs, it can be a big problem, and it would be hard to figure out where it originated, right? And I get the fact it's not, not easy to keep all these things, these inputs and outputs and prompts. But I do think that that is one of the risks we have to be aware of if we're not able to retain those, and to figure out where exactly did we have something that was faulty that ended up poisoning our future output. Um, and so I don't have a very sort of um, good answer for how much in books and records um, you know each advisor should retain, other than to say, look, it's best practice to maintain your inputs and outputs and your prompts, right, to make sure that you can show your work, because the SEC and regulators generally want to see where you got to, right? Of course, I think that there are differing levels of risk depending on how you're using the tool, right? I mean, if you're using the tool for advice and recommendations, then it's going to be even more vital to maintain those records, right? Um, Marketing content, it's still important to make sure you don't put out anything factual, um but if you're let's say putting together something that just like tells you how to say something better. Yes, it is important to try to retain that, but there's a different sort of level of risk that I see, right? Both from a regulatory and a legal perspective, in terms of whether you retain like all of that stuff, right? When we're thinking about things practically. So I think it is important to bear these things in mind, but it is definitely a problem that we have, especially since it is definitely likely that folks will end up using outputs from AI tools as inputs in other queries, right? So yeah, so it's an issue that's I admit there's not an easy solution for it.
Yeah, yeah, you've got me thinking, on the one end, I think about how hard it would be to parse through and decide what you're going to do and where you're going to store everything. Are you going to end up with
Mhm.
just terabyte upon terabyte of outputs and prompts and projects across all these different tools? And yeah, I don't have a solution for it either.
Yeah.
And I want to speculate here for a second. Can you see, as we get a little bit more advanced and create different workflows, can you see it being useful to distinguish between different types of contexts? And here's what I mean by that from a practical level. Imagine a project that you call, brainstorming, where you're just, having dialogue back and forth. It's very fast, it's very loose. You're generating potential ideas, potential directions. And then you create another project where you're like, you know what, this is really where I'm going to crystallize and start to separate the signal from the noise. And this is where I'm going to add the things that are making my editorial cut, the things that I'm using my judgment on so that
Hmm.
it ends up in this project. That way I can separate all the theory, conjecture, and experimentation from the areas where I'm really going to put these things to use
Right,
so
right,
that I can avoid malignant facts,
right,
malignant
right.
data from metastasizing across all these other decisions that I may make downstream.
I mean, I think it's a good way of actually sort of thinking about the record retention, because generally speaking, it's the outputs that the regulators are concerned with, right? Whether it's advice or if it's a communication or something like that, that's what they're really concerned with. What does the client end up seeing, right? Or what does the firm end up putting out otherwise, right? And so I do think that that's one way where you can probably cut down on sort of how you retain records and things like that, and also parse out sort of where you end up, so that you're not sort of poisoning the well in terms of your sort of you know your final answer, as it were, right? In terms of the outputs that you want to use going forward. That seems like a pretty good category, sort of you know uh operational process, right? And again, it sort of goes back to the fact that you want to think about this in a process. I mean, I know for me, oftentimes I will think about sort of just starting a new chat every time I want to do something, but in reality it does help to be organized, right? And
Right.
to really understand where you're going to do what. And it's not only good for productivity, but it's good too, so that you can sort of end up figuring out sort of where stuff is.
Right. And you gave me a few interesting things to think about. And you made a statement here that I really want to zoom in on, which is, what output is what ultimately comes under scrutiny.
Hmm.
So it's the output and the accuracy of what that output is, not necessarily how we came about or how we created the output.
Right,
But
right.
it's still helpful to have a record of how we arrived at the conclusions we arrived at.
Yeah, I mean the regulators, if you end up coming up with an output, they will want to see supporting documentation, right? For instance, if you calculate performance results, they're going to want to see the supporting information. they don't necessarily have to see every sort of version of how you ended up sort of deriving results that you ended up not producing. But if you produce results, they do want to see what went into that final sort of version, right?
So basically, they don't need to see a cocktail napkin,
Right.
scribblings, or a whiteboard that you may
At
have been
least that's not the
brainstorming
way that I
on.
interpret it. I mean, I think that they're concerned with making sure they understand how you got to somewhere where you end up producing some kind of a, an output or something that you're required to do otherwise.
Got it. All right, so I'm gonna move on to one of the next points here, but I do want to prompt everyone here. If you have any questions, feel free to add them to the Q&A. We'll have somebody looking over those. Let me pop this open real quick. That way I can see it on my screen. And let's talk a little bit about implementing compliance-friendly AI usage. And
Hmm.
just as an example of that, Richard. So, we create a lot of content internally. We work with a lot of different writers, and I'm showing a slide right now that's of a GPT that I made called the compliance copy grader. So
Uh-huh.
I took a bunch of PDFs from the SEC,
Hmm.
from FINRA. I added that to a project folder, and I told the GPT, hey, I'm going to give you bits of content here. I want you to look through all these regulations. I want you to also look at this list of banned words and
Hmm.
banned phrases. I want you to be on the lookout for anything promissory, anything that is scare tactic-y or hyperbolic. And I want you to grade it on a scale of 1 to 5, 5 being great,
Hmm.
1 being terrible. But I don't want you to give me answers. I want you to, tell me what makes the grade, and then give me suggestions on why it may violate some of these regulations.
Hmm.
And again, this GPT bot does not replace
Hmm.
legal advice. It does
Hmm.
not replace compliance. For me, it was just a way to have an initial skim, an initial
Yes.
editorial
Yeah.
layer. That way I could submit something a little bit cleaner so that I can make things go a little bit faster with compliance and ad review. But
Yeah.
do you have any recommendations on, policies, procedures, ways to train up um, teammates
Yeah.
and interns or other employees on best AI practices that are compliance friendly?
Well, I mean, I think that, the AI is flowing into compliance now too, right? It is able to, when we do ongoing compliance program management for our clients, we are using AI tools in that work. And part of the reason is because it allows us to do things that we would never fully have the time to do, all with the view towards the fact that we still need human supervision, right? So I think that, even in compliance, it is helpful to embrace the use of AI tools because they can absolutely save time, process volumes of information that would be super, super hard to do. For instance, doing trade monitoring to figure out if there's front running, or like you were pointing out, doing marketing reviews. There's a frontline pass that AI compliance tools can absolutely do to speed that work up nowadays, right? Um, I think it's in terms of training folks, with respect to how to use AI tools. Couple things come to mind, right? One is, if folks are going to really use AI, it's important to spend time to understand how those AI tools are working, right? And to
Mhm.
so you've got to take, and you and I were talking about this before, is that you need to take the time to understand what, sort of how these tools are working so that you can use them effectively, but use them in a way that will sort of reduce risk. Um, but it's also sort of very important to make sure that um, you're giving folks an environment that is hopefully the most protective for them. And what I mean by this is, I know this is going to be hard for some folks, but a lot of folks right now are using their personal accounts, right, to
Right.
do work that is for the RIA. One, it's not easy. That doesn't allow for retention of books and records. But two, it makes it very hard to end up supervising any of that work because it's in some folks' personal accounts, and you don't want to go in there. And so I think some of the best advice I can give folks is try to move over to enterprise tool, especially where we're talking about sort of the most use cases, right? One, oftentimes these tools will help a lot with this record retention, but it'll allow for supervision and oversight by your compliance folks, right? Those are a couple tools I would tips I would suggest.
Yeah, that's such an important point, especially when it comes to adopting these tools. And if anyone is a little bit of a laggard adopting these tools and they're working with teams, just these tools are available at a consumer level. And a lot of them are also freemium as well. So that is definitely a risk I would be thinking of, and really encouraging people to have the policies in place and think about those team accounts and some of those enterprise level offerings. Is that in any conversations that you have with different firms? Are you finding that they're using enterprise tools?
I
Um,
think I think some firms are starting to, but I think sort of along with everybody else, people are just still trying to get their hands around what these tools are doing, and I totally get that, right? I think it's one of those things where, um, one of the reasons I like writing about this stuff is it helps me maybe to process some of this stuff for myself, right? Is in identifying sort of where we can reduce risk given that we know the environment continues to change. I would say that we're still at the sort of cusp of getting our hands around sort of how to do this most sort of sort of in a way that mitigates risk.
right. So I have a question here, Rich.
Mhm.
Let's see here. Question came into the Q&A. We are evaluating recording note-taking services.
Mhm.
Can you explain in more detail about the books and records requirements for call recording, transcript, note-taking services? Does the recorded call audio need to be retained? And should the original transcript be retained, the output notes, etc.?
So there's a couple ways to think about this, right? Written communications are generally sort of retained in terms of, as sort of emails and things like that. Those are required to be retained, right? Of course, if you have voice recordings, phone calls, those are not retained because it's not practicable to retain those. The interesting part about the recordings now you have with transcript availability is, I guess, if you're producing transcripts, you're keeping those, right? um and so there's a couple things to think about here. Is that, yeah, generally written communications with clients are required to be retained, but you also asked about sort of other ancillary sort of uses, right, of those transcripts to generate additional content. And that is where it's difficult because that can fall into different buckets, right? If the outputs are used to sort of generate content that otherwise communicates with clients or generate investment recommendations for clients, regulators are going to want to see that. Um, and the other thing that can be challenging from a books and records standpoint is, as many of these categories as there are, it's not like there's a a a clear black and white line as to whether some of this stuff falls within the required records or not. And especially when you talk about new technologies, yes, they update the books and records rules from time to time, but as with, we were saying earlier, with all regulation, it's kind of behind, right? It doesn't necessarily give us sort of a nuanced answer based on a different form of form of output, and so you're just sort of mostly going based on sort of what the actual content is that you're keeping, and so Yeah, so sometimes there are no easy answers, but that's the best way I can answer that one.
So a lot of it has to do with us thinking about the actual output rather than anything and everything that we might be saving, i.e., recorded audio. It's more like, how are you using that audio, and what are you creating from the audio or the transcript, etc.
I mean, I think that's important. I mean, I think that, when you're talking about, I mean, even if you're producing a transcript, let's say, of a communication, right? I do think that even if you don't use that for anything else, then it's a required record. Although I guess, the part of the point of retaining it is that you can use it, right? And perhaps summarize it and provide the summary to your clients, right? And so I think that, I wouldn't go as far as to say that if it's only output, right, that you retain it, but sort of, if there are written records that we're talking about relating to these communications, I think it's safe to say it's better to make sure you keep those.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Okay. We're coming up towards the end here. I want to share this last slide. This is QR code. We've been talking about AI as it relates to compliance. We've talked about creating outputs, creating marketing materials, creating materials that help guide decision making. So, what we're doing at Snappy Kraken, if you want to help, serve your clients better, if you want to grow business through using a modern growth stack, we encourage you to book a demo with us and see the different content, the different tools that we have available. And, one of the earlier slides I showed alluded to the fact that on our roadmap, we're having to think about AI. We're having to think about compliance and all the different regulations so that we can bake those in and not turn this into a wild West cavalier attitude where we're just baking in any and every tool. We have to make
Mhm.
sure that they're vetted. We have to make sure that they take a lot of these regulations and risks into consideration before we make them available. But Rich, I have a couple other questions in here that just popped up on the
Sure.
Q&A.
Yeah.
These I mean, I have my thoughts on this, but I want to see what your take
Okay.
is.
Okay.
It's uh AI can make a lazy person lazier. How do you avoid that challenge, Rich?
Um, I think at the end of the day that there's a certain amount that you can use. You I do think that can be true. Um, which is why I think it's important to make sure that we are really using these tools in a way that only sort of supplements what we do. Right. It's important to um, to use these tools in a way that can be helpful to us without compromising, sort of our analytical thinking, and how we're using our brains. Because in reality, it's those insights, right, that you get when you think about how you are serving your clients and things like that, that are really what's valuable, right? And something oftentimes that these tools don't have access to, right? Um, and so I think it's important to do your own analysis, to continue to sharpen skills as it relates to your practice, and because if you don't, then what happens is you rely on these tools and then you lose your edge because you end up not knowing what, if it's, if what it's actually producing is actually right. So I do think it is a risk that we have to be cognizant of, and we have to find other sort of ways of making sure that we are keeping our skills sharp, keeping our knowledge sharp.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what one of the things that you mentioned earlier, which was, you're you're in the driver's seat. Garbage in, garbage out. Be
Mhm.
intentional about these tools. Be intentional about the tools that you choose. Be intentional about the objective. Be clear. What is it that you want out of this tool rather than just picking up the tool blindly
Mhm.
and telling it to just come up with a result for you. You need
Yeah.
to have that end in mind. And something else that you said there, if we're, this is an industry that relies on trust.
Mhm.
It's an industry that relies on expertise.
Mhm.
And I looked at a list of like what qualifies someone as an expert, and there was this
Mhm.
whole hierarchy. And the list said that in order for someone to be an expert, they need to remember, understand, apply,
Right.
analyze,
Mhm.
evaluate, and create
Mhm.
according to the things that they are an expert in.
Mhm.
So, how are you going to be an expert
Mhm.
if you abdicate and just tell a tool to do all of those other things for you? Remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create.
Right.
You ask a tool to do that for you. Where does that leave you as the expert if you're not exercising any of those cognitive
You
faculties?
lose your edge. You'll basically
Right.
lose your edge. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And we can use these tools to help us sharpen our
Right.
edge. And that's one of the things
Absolutely.
I'm excited about.
I think that's very true. I totally agree with that.
So on that note, Rich, it's been an honor co-hosting this webinar with you. In the chat, someone just dropped your LinkedIn, so you can
Thank you.
connect with Richard on LinkedIn. We hope to see some additional articles come from you and what you're discovering, and any other practical applications that you're coming across in your line of work, Rich.
Thank you for having me. It's been a super fun conversation. I'm excited to see where things go. This is part of the fun for me. When you're trying to figure out where things are going, and you need to adapt, and that's exciting.
Yeah, me too. All right. Thanks so much, Rich. Thanks for joining us, gang.
Thank you.